The document was stamped 3 times before anyone dared to read it aloud. Unit designation, Eastern Front. Autumn 1944. Status, destroyed. The report was dry, precise, merciless. Coordinates marked a strip of forest that no longer appeared on updated maps. Burned, shelled, erased into a gray smear. Enemy artillery, encirclement. No breakthrough, no retreat, no radio contact after 02:17 hours. The final line carried the weight of a verdict rather than a conclusion. No survivors. The file should have ended there. Thousands like it did. Entire battalions vanished between paragraphs, reduced to ink and signatures. Clerks filed the folder. Officers nodded. Another unit lost to the earth, to mud, to smoke, to time. But 2 weeks later, the forest gave something back. It began with a sentry at a secondary field camp, just before dawn. Visibility was poor. Fog pressed low against the ground, swallowing the tree line and muting sound. The war had taught men to distrust silence more than gunfire, and this silence was wrong. Too even, too deliberate. At first, the sentry thought it was a trick of exhaustion. Shapes forming where none should be. Movement without sound. Then the figures stepped out of the fog. They came in formation. Not running, not staggering, not wounded in the way men usually were. 37 soldiers. The exact number listed in the destroyed unit's manifest. Their uniforms were torn and darkened, stiff with old blood and soil, but they were upright. Helmets sat straight on their heads. Rifles were carried properly, barrels down, fingers disciplined away from triggers. Their boots struck the ground in near-perfect rhythm. No one spoke. The sentry raised his weapon. His hands shook. Training screamed at him to challenge, to shout, to demand identification, but his voice failed. What stood before him felt incorrect. Not hostile, not friendly, but misplaced. Like objects returned to the wrong shelf. When the camp lights were raised, officers rushed out expecting deserters or enemy infiltrators. What they saw froze them in place. Dog tags matched records of the dead. Faces matched photographs pinned in files marked KIA. One officer recognized his own brother. A medic was called, then another, then a surgeon. They examined the men under harsh lamps while the fog thinned behind them, retreating back toward the forest as if it had only come to deliver its message. Bullets were still lodged in muscle and bone. Shrapnel sat embedded near vital organs. One man had a chest wound that should have collapsed his lung days ago. Another's leg showed signs of infection that should have killed him slowly and screaming. Yet they stood. They did not complain. They did not ask where they were. They did not ask how long they had been gone. When spoken to, they answered, but only when directly addressed, and only in short, flat sentences. Their voices carried no fear, no relief, no disbelief. When asked how they survived, every man gave the same response. We did not. The medical report that followed would later be locked away, marked unreliable. Heart rates were irregular but present. Breathing was shallow but steady. Pain response was absent. Pupils reacted slowly, as if the signal had to travel farther than it should. One physician wrote a single sentence in the margin of his notes, then crossed it out so hard the paper tore. These men are operational, but whatever made them human has not returned with them. By nightfall, the soldiers were placed in a secured holding area. Guards were posted. Orders were issued not to discuss what had happened. The war could tolerate mass death. It could not tolerate men who came back from it unchanged and wrong. And as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, no one noticed that none of the returned soldiers lay down. They stood in place, eyes open, facing the direction of the forest, waiting. By morning, word had spread through the camp despite orders to the contrary. Soldiers whispered in ration lines. Medics avoided eye contact. Officers kept their voices low, as if sound itself might provoke something. The returned men were still standing when the sun rose. Not rigid, not locked in place. Simply upright, balanced, alert. Their eyes followed movement with mechanical precision. When instructed to sit, they did so at once, lowering themselves carefully, back straight, hands resting on their knees in identical positions. When told to stand again, they rose together, as if responding to a single signal no one else could hear. Medical examination resumed at first light. The lead surgeon began with what he expected to be routine. He pressed fingers into bruised flesh. No flinch. He twisted a wrist far beyond its natural angle. No reaction. A needle was driven deep into the thigh of one man to test reflex. Nothing. The surgeon noted the absence of pain response and ordered stronger stimuli, uncomfortable with how quickly his curiosity was overtaking his fear. A cauterization tool was heated and applied briefly to a forearm, already marked by old burns. The flesh reacted. The body reacted. The man did not. No scream, no tightening of muscles, no widening of eyes. "Do you feel this?" the surgeon asked. "Yes," the soldier replied after a pause. "Does it hurt?" Another pause. Longer this time. "No." The word was not defiant. It was not confused. It was simply stated, like a measurement or a fact. When asked to describe what he felt instead, the man searched for an answer that did not seem to exist in his vocabulary. "There is pressure," he said finally. Then nothing. Amputations followed. They were not ordered for cruelty, but necessity. One man's lower leg was necrotic. Infection had advanced far beyond recovery. Under normal circumstances, he would have been delirious with fever, begging for relief or mercy. He watched the procedure with calm interest. No anesthetic was administered. None was needed. The saw cut through bone. Blood flowed, less than expected, darker than it should have been. The surgeon's hands trembled. Assistants turned away. One vomited behind a curtain. The patient remained conscious throughout. When it was over, he looked down at the bandaged stump, then back up at the medical staff. "Am I still required?" he asked. That question unsettled the room more than the operation itself. Food was brought. The men ate only when instructed, chewing slowly, methodically, as if performing a remembered task rather than satisfying hunger. Water was consumed in measured sips. None asked for more. None asked for less. Sleep never came. Over 24 hours passed, then 36, then 48. The soldiers' eyes never closed. Guards were rotated more frequently than the men themselves. Those assigned to watch the holding area reported the same thing. The soldiers stood or sat in silence, occasionally shifting their weight, occasionally turning their heads toward the eastern tree line. Always toward the forest. Orders were issued to keep them under constant observation. High command demanded answers. Medical command demanded explanations. Intelligence officers demanded interviews. The interviews yielded little. Names were recalled without hesitation. Ranks were correct. Dates of enlistment matched records. Childhood details surfaced intact. Villages, schools, fathers' occupations. But when questioned about the final engagement, the responses fractured. Some remembered advancing through smoke. Others recalled silence where artillery should have been. Several described falling, not from wounds, but from exhaustion, as if gravity had simply decided to claim them all at once. Then came the blank space. Every man described it differently, yet the language they used was nearly identical. There was no time. There was no pain. We waited. Waited where? They were asked. The men exchanged glances, brief and synchronized. "There," one said. He pointed east. That night, the first incident occurred. At precisely 02:17 hours, the same time radio contact had been lost weeks earlier, all 37 soldiers stood up at once. Guards shouted commands. Weapons were raised. Floodlights snapped on. The men did not react. They moved toward the exit in orderly lines, adjusting their pace to avoid collisions, hands empty, posture calm. When physically restrained, they did not resist. They did not struggle. They simply stopped, as if pausing a task that could be resumed later. One guard, shaken and angry, struck a soldier across the face with the butt of his rifle. The impact split skin. Bone cracked. The soldier did not blink. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward the guard and spoke in a voice stripped of emotion. "You should not interrupt this." The guard stepped back, weapon dropping from his hands. By dawn, 2 men were dead. One was the guard, found in his post, heart stopped without signs of trauma. His expression was peaceful, almost relieved. The other was one of the returned soldiers. He had collapsed where he stood, eyes open, body intact. Medical staff could find no cause of death. His heart had simply ceased its irregular rhythm and gone still. Before removing the body, a nurse noticed something written on the inside of his palm. 3 words, carved shallowly into the skin, as if done long before the flesh had lost its sensitivity. "We are late." By order of command, the holding area was relocated farther from camp, closer to the forest. The decision to move the holding area was justified on paper as a security measure. The men unsettled the camp. Morale reports used cautious language: unease, fatigue, psychological strain. But the truth was simpler. Soldiers were afraid to sleep near them, afraid to sleep at all. So the returned unit was transferred to a series of reinforced barracks at the eastern perimeter, less than a kilometer from the tree line. The distance felt intentional, though no one admitted it, as if proximity might calm them, as if returning them closer to whatever had released them would stabilize what remained unstable. The new facility had once housed prisoners: thick doors, barred windows, concrete floors stained by older wars. Guards were doubled. Orders were clear: observe, record, do not engage unless necessary. The men entered without protest. They arranged themselves along the far wall, standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed forward. The space between them was exact, measured to the inch, as though they still felt the presence of equipment they no longer carried, or comrades no longer there. Medical staff followed. Examinations resumed with greater urgency. If the men could not feel pain, perhaps they could still feel fear. If not fear, then at least fatigue. Something had to give. Blood samples were drawn. The blood flowed slowly, thick and dark, coagulating almost immediately. Laboratory analysis revealed nothing conclusive. No unfamiliar compounds, no obvious toxins. Oxygen levels were low, but not fatal. Hormone markers were erratic, fluctuating without clear pattern. One technician noted that the samples behaved differently once removed from the body. Under the microscope, red cells appeared intact, but movement was sluggish, as if responding to delayed instructions. The heart readings were worse. Electrocardiograms showed irregular, staggered rhythms, pauses too long to sustain consciousness, followed by sudden corrective surges. By every medical standard, several of the men should have been unconscious. 2 should have been dead already. They were not. Attempts to sedate them failed. Standard dosages produced no effect. Increased dosages produced only slight slowing of movement, never unconsciousness. One physician, frustrated and visibly shaken, suggested electroshock therapy. The proposal was denied. Not for ethical reasons. For fear of what might happen if whatever held the men together was interrupted too abruptly. Sleep deprivation took its toll on everyone else. By the 4th night, guards reported auditory hallucinations, footsteps where there were none, voices just beyond comprehension. Several claimed they could hear breathing in the barracks, even when the men were standing perfectly still. One guard swore he heard humming. When questioned, he could not describe the tune. The men themselves showed no change, no deterioration, no improvement. Time passed around them without effect. Intelligence officers arrived on the 5th day. They approached the interviews differently, less concerned with physiology, more with motivation. They asked about orders, about loyalty, about command structure. The answers were precise. Yes, I would follow orders. Yes, I recognize the chain of command. Yes, I understand the objectives. Would you return to the front if ordered? The men paused at that question. Not all of them. Just long enough for the officers to exchange glances. We are already assigned, one replied. Assigned to whom? An officer pressed. The soldier's eyes shifted, not to the interrogator, but past him, toward the eastern wall. There, he said again. The same word, the same direction. The officers changed tactics. They asked about death. What happens when a man dies? One asked carefully. The soldiers did not answer immediately. Several turned their heads slightly, as if listening to something far away. When a man dies, one said, he is supposed to stop. Another added, we did not. Why not? A longer pause this time, a measurable one. A doctor later noted that during that pause, heart activity across the group briefly synchronized. Because it was not finished, the first soldier said. That answer ended the interview. The sixth night broke the pattern. At 02:17 hours, as before, the men stood. But this time, they did not move toward the doors. They turned inward. 36 soldiers, one less than before, faced each other in the center of the barracks, forming a rough circle. Guards shouted. Floodlights came on. Weapons were raised. The men ignored everything. They stood so close that their shoulders touched. Heads bowed slightly, hands at their sides. Then one of them spoke. Not loudly. Not to anyone in the room. It is closer, he said. Another responded. We can feel it. A third, voice almost reverent. It remembers us. The guards opened fire. Not in panic, but protocol. Single shots, controlled. Aimed center mass. Bullets struck flesh. Several men were thrown backward by the force of impact. 2 fell to the floor. They rose again. Wounds closed slowly, clumsily, as if the body was relearning the concept of repair. Blood seeped, then stopped. One man's arm hung at an unnatural angle, bone clearly broken. He repositioned it with his other hand, setting it back into place with a sound that made hardened soldiers turn away. The officer in charge ordered a ceasefire. The men resumed their positions, as if the interruption had been minor. At 02:19 hours, they stopped moving entirely. Every heart monitor flatlined at once. Silence filled the barracks, sudden and absolute. Medics rushed in despite orders. Pulse checks, stethoscopes, no heartbeat, no breath. 36 bodies lay, or stood frozen in place, eyes open, expressions neutral, dead. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then one heart restarted. Then another. Then all of them. Not gradually, not chaotically. Together. The officer vomited into a corner. A medic began to cry and could not stop. Another laughed, hysterically, until he was restrained. The men straightened, returned to their positions along the wall. The circle dissolved, as if it had never existed. No one slept after that. High Command intervened directly. Orders arrived sealed and unsigned. The language was clinical, detached, unmistakably final. The unit was to be removed from active camps immediately. No further testing. No further interviews. No written correspondence. The file was to be transferred to a restricted archive and reclassified. The men were to be escorted east, not to a base, not to a facility, just east. The escort detail consisted of 12 armed soldiers and 2 officers. They were instructed to maintain distance and avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. At dawn, the returned soldiers were assembled. They formed ranks without instruction. As they marched, no one gave cadence. No commands were spoken. They moved as one. When the forest edge came into view, the men slowed, not from fatigue, but anticipation. Several turned their faces upward, inhaling deeply for the first time since their return. The escort halted at the tree line. Orders were read aloud, though no one was listening anymore. You are to proceed no further, the commanding officer said. The returned soldiers stopped. They faced the forest. Then, one by one, they stepped forward. No guard tried to stop them. Branches swallowed their forms. Fog closed behind them. Within minutes, the forest was empty again. No shots were fired. No pursuit ordered. Only one thing remained. Perfectly aligned boot prints leading into the trees. None leading back. The official report that followed was brief. Unit failed to reintegrate due to extreme psychological trauma. Personnel reassigned. The author of the report requested reassignment the following week. He cited insomnia. He did not mention that every night, at exactly 02:17 hours, he woke with the certainty that something was standing just beyond his window, waiting for the moment it would be called back again. In the weeks that followed, the forest was placed off limits. Maps were redrawn with vague boundaries. Patrol routes were adjusted to arc away from that section of land, as if avoiding a wound that refused to close. Official explanations cited unexploded ordnance, unstable ground, lingering enemy presence. None of it convinced the men who had seen the soldiers walk into the trees and vanish without hesitation. The escort detail was reassigned within days. 2 were transferred to rear units. 1 was hospitalized after a nervous collapse. Another deserted entirely, leaving behind only his rifle and a note that contained a single sentence written over and over until the paper tore. They are not lost. They are deployed. The forest itself showed no outward change. No mass graves. No disturbed soil. No signs of prolonged human presence. Yet, animals avoided it. Birds altered their migratory paths. Local villagers, those who had survived long enough to become accustomed to fear, reported an unnatural quiet at night, as though sound itself hesitated before entering the trees. In early winter, the first civilian report arrived. A farmer traveling before dawn claimed he had seen soldiers moving along the tree line. Not a patrol, not an occupying force. Too orderly for refugees, too disciplined for deserters. They walked without torches, without speaking, their silhouettes faint against the snow. When questioned, the farmer admitted something that unsettled the officer, taking the report more than the sighting itself. "They were counting," the man said. "Counting what?" The farmer shook his head. "I don't know, but they were not counting forward." The report was filed and dismissed. So were the next 3. A railway worker swore he saw figures standing between the trees as his train passed, evenly spaced, facing the tracks. A partisan group reported hearing synchronized footsteps at night, pacing their camp from beyond visibility. A young woman sheltering in a burned-out village claimed she heard voices reciting names she recognized, men from her town who had died months earlier. Each account was labeled stress-induced hallucination. The war had trained everyone to accept such explanations, but something in the pattern resisted easy dismissal. All sightings occurred between 02 and 02:30 hours. All witnesses described silence as the most disturbing detail. Not the presence of the men, but the way the environment seemed to withdraw around them. Wind stopped. Insects vanished. Even firelight dimmed, as if unwilling to illuminate what stood beyond it. Military intelligence reopened the file under a different designation. No longer a medical anomaly. No longer psychological trauma. Now, unexplained post-combat phenomenon. The man assigned to review the case had not been present at the camp. He approached the reports with professional distance, confident in his ability to dismantle myth. That confidence lasted 3 days. By the 4th night, he began waking at 02:17 without knowing why. He would lie still, heart racing, convinced that if he moved, he would miss something important. That there was a sound just beyond his hearing, a rhythm his body recognized, even if his mind did not. On the 7th night, he dreamed of marching, not as himself, but as part of something larger. His feet moved without effort. His lungs did not burn. There was no fear, no exhaustion, only direction. When he woke, his boots were muddy. The forest was visited once more. this time officially. A reconnaissance team of 6 was dispatched under the pretense of clearing hazards. They entered shortly after dawn, equipped with radios, flares, and strict instructions to withdraw at the first sign of irregularity. They maintained contact for the first hour. Then transmissions degraded. Not silence, distortion. Voices stretched and flattened, words arriving out of order. One man reported that his compass had begun spinning slowly, never settling. Another described a sensation of pressure behind the eyes, as if altitude were changing despite level ground. At 02:03 the following morning, contact was lost entirely. Search efforts lasted 3 days. Only 4 bodies were recovered. They showed no signs of violence, no wounds, no struggle, no defensive marks. Each was found standing upright, eyes open, facing deeper into the forest. Their hearts had stopped simultaneously, as confirmed by wristwatch readings, frozen at the same minute. The 2 missing men were never found. The operation was classified. The forest was erased from logistical planning. It became a blank space between routes, an absence on the map that everyone learned to ignore. By 1945, the war moved on. Front lines shifted. Armies advanced and retreated. Cities fell and were liberated. The world grew louder, more chaotic, drowning out smaller horrors beneath larger ones. But the sightings did not stop. They spread. Reports emerged from other forests, other borders, other ruins where units had vanished under impossible circumstances. Always at night, always in formation, always moving toward something unseen. The descriptions were consistent enough to suggest coordination, yet no communication was ever observed. They did not speak to the living. They did not acknowledge them. They marched. In one case, a group of resistance fighters encountered the figures crossing a frozen river. The ice did not crack beneath their weight. When challenged, the soldiers halted, turned in unison, and stared. One resistance fighter fired. The bullet struck a man in the chest and fell harmlessly to the ice. The soldier looked down at the impact point, then back up. "We are delayed," he said. Then the group continued across the river and disappeared into the trees on the far bank. The phrase appeared again and again in subsequent encounters. "We are delayed. We are not finished. We are still assigned." No 2 witnesses ever heard the same sentence twice, yet the meaning was unmistakable. Something had been interrupted, something that now insisted on completion. By the end of the war, intelligence agencies on both sides had fragments of the story. No one possessed the full picture. No one wanted to. The official narrative settled on a familiar explanation: extreme trauma, mass hysteria, the psychological debris of total war. It was convincing enough for public consumption. Privately, files were sealed. Doctors who had treated the returned soldiers refused further comment. Several destroyed their own notes. One burned his journals entirely and never practiced medicine again. When asked why, years later, he answered only once. "They were not suffering," he said. "That was the problem." In 1947, a final report was added to the archive. A border patrol in a newly redrawn region encountered a column of soldiers moving through fog just before dawn. Their uniforms were outdated, their insignia unrecognizable, their faces pale, almost waxen. The patrol leader noted an overwhelming sense of familiarity, as though he should have known them. As the column passed, one soldier turned his head slightly. For a moment, their eyes met. The soldier nodded, not in greeting, in acknowledgement. The patrol did not engage. They watched until the last figure vanished into the mist. When the patrol leader checked his watch afterward, he realized that nearly 20 minutes were missing. His men could not account for the time. That night, he dreamed of marching, of standing in a forest without fear, without hunger, without pain, of waiting for something vast and inevitable to arrive. He woke at 02:17. The war ended. The files remained. And in forests across Eastern Europe, There are places where the ground bears the faint imprint of boots that never turn back, where compasses fail, where sound thins, where men who know the cost of death feel a sudden, inexplicable pull toward the trees. As if somewhere beyond the darkness, a roll call is still unfinished, and the soldiers who refuse to die are still on their way to answer it. The years that followed should have buried the story. They did not. Instead, it sank deeper, into classified margins, into personal notebooks never meant to be read, into the private fears of men who had survived enough death to recognize when something worse had slipped past it. In 1948, a military census uncovered an inconsistency no one could explain. Across multiple regions of Eastern Europe, supply manifests listed minor but persistent shortages. Boots, rations, ammunition, always small quantities, always missing from depots nearest large forested areas. Too little to trigger theft investigations, too consistent to be coincidence. At first, clerks blamed accounting errors. Then a quartermaster noticed something strange. The missing items matched obsolete equipment. Models no longer issued, calibers officially phased out, uniforms no longer standard, supplies no active unit should have been using, yet someone was. A quiet internal inquiry followed. No press, no paperwork that could circulate. Interviews were conducted under the pretense of routine audits. Several depot guards admitted to something they could not fully articulate. They had left the supplies out, not stolen, not misplaced. Left. One guard described stacking boots near the tree line without remembering why. Another recalled unlocking a storage cage and stepping away, convinced he had been ordered to do so, though no order existed. When questioned later, all described the same sensation. Not coercion, expectation. As if failing to comply would delay something that already resented being delayed. The inquiry was closed without conclusion. That winter, a harsh one even by regional standards, reports of nocturnal movement increased. Villages near forests described lights moving between trees without flame. Old men swore the ground vibrated faintly beneath their feet at night, like distant marching muffled by earth and snow. Children began drawing pictures. They drew lines of identical figures beneath tall black shapes. They drew forests with no animals. They drew watches with the same time, marked again and again. 0217. Teachers dismissed it as coincidence. Parents did not. In one village, a schoolmaster confronted a boy who refused to stop sketching soldiers during lessons. "Why do you keep drawing them?" he asked. The boy looked up, confused by the question. "They're not soldiers," he said. "What are they then?" The boy hesitated, searching for a word that felt wrong in his mouth. "They're what comes after." The school closed the following month after several children stopped sleeping entirely. In the archives, a pattern began to emerge, not in what was recorded, but in what was avoided. Any document that attempted to define the phenomenon directly was missing. Summaries existed, references existed, crossnotes existed, but the original analyses were gone. Someone, at some point, had decided that naming the thing was more dangerous than ignoring it. One file survived by accident. It belonged to a junior medical officer reassigned before he could be instructed properly. His notes were unpolished, personal, written with the urgency of someone who believed he might not have much time left to write at all. He described examining one of the returned soldiers during the brief window before the unit's final march. He described placing his stethoscope against the man's chest and hearing something that was not a heartbeat. There was rhythm, the note read, but it did not belong to the body. It was too slow, too patient. The officer wrote that he felt an overwhelming pressure to remove the stethoscope, as if listening longer would invite participation. He ended the entry with a question written 3 times, each iteration shakier than the last. If death is a destination, what happens when someone misses the turn? The officer disappeared in 1949. His apartment showed no signs of struggle. His shoes were gone, His watch lay on the bedside table, stopped at 02:17. By the early 1950s, the phenomenon adapted. Sightings grew rarer, but more deliberate. No longer wandering, no longer passing through populated areas. The figures were seen only near sites of mass death. Former battlefields, abandoned camps, forests where artillery had erased entire units without record. They did not appear to civilians unless noticed first. But soldiers still saw them. Men on night duty reported an instinctive awareness, seconds before the figures became visible. A sense of alignment, as if their own posture suddenly mattered. Several found themselves standing straighter without realizing why. One veteran described it best during a closed psychiatric evaluation. "It's like seeing someone continue a sentence you thought had ended," he said. "You don't know what they're saying anymore, but you know it's wrong to interrupt." In 1953, a final attempt was made to force understanding. A controlled observation was authorized at a decommissioned battlefield near the original forest. Sensors were placed, cameras hidden, recording equipment calibrated to activate automatically at night. At 02:14, the instruments began to fail, not all at once, sequentially, as if something was moving through their range, interfering gently, methodically. At 02:17, the cameras activated. The footage survived. It showed nothing for the first 30 seconds. Then, the image shifted. The ground appeared to ripple, not violently, but subtly, like fabric settling into place. Fog thickened without wind. Trees bent inward by fractions of degrees, responding to pressure that did not touch them. Then, the figures appeared, not emerging from the forest, forming within it. They resolved slowly, like photographs developing in dark fluid. Each man distinct, yet identical in posture. Their faces were clearer than in any previous report. They were not expressionless. They were focused. One by one, they turned their heads toward the camera. The footage ended there. When reviewed later, analysts noticed something that chilled them more than the sight itself. The men were not looking at the camera. They were looking past it, as if something behind the lens had arrived late. The operation was terminated. The site was abandoned. The footage sealed. The last official mention of the phenomenon appears in a 1957 memorandum consisting of a single paragraph. Continued observation unnecessary. The event demonstrates no hostile intent toward the living. Engagement is neither required nor advised. Whatever process is underway appears self-contained. Handwritten in the margin, in a different ink, until it isn't. After that, the world moved on. Borders hardened. Governments fell. New wars replaced old ones, each producing its own ghosts. But in the forest where the earth still remembers what it swallowed, things remain unfinished. There are nights when the ground hums just below hearing. Nights when compasses hesitate. Nights when men wake with mud on their boots and cannot explain how it got there. Veterans sometimes speak of it in moments of unguarded honesty. They say death is not the worst thing war can do to a man. They say the worst thing is being kept standing, kept waiting, kept assigned to something that no longer needs a name. And if you ever find yourself near an old battlefield at night, if the air grows heavy, if sound seems to pull away from you, if your watch stops for no clear reason, do not follow the urge to stand straighter. Do not step toward the trees, because somewhere beyond the fog, a formation is still missing men. And the soldiers who refuse to die are still counting backward, waiting for whatever comes when the number finally reaches 0. The counting did not stop. That was the mistake made by those who believed the phenomenon was static, something left behind by war, sealed into the soil like unexploded ordnance. In truth, it was adaptive. It learned from attention, from proximity, from memory. By the early 1960s, the reports had thinned, not because the marches had ceased, but because fewer people were left who could recognize what they were seeing. The forests had changed. Roads cut through them. Power lines hummed overhead. Villages grew into towns. The living imposed order, convinced that order erased what came before. It did not. The soldiers adjusted. They no longer appeared as full columns. That drew too much notice. Instead, witnesses described smaller units. 3, 5, sometimes only one figure moving through the trees. Always upright. Always deliberate. Always following a path no map acknowledged. Those who saw only one often fared worse. A forestry worker in 1962 reported encountering a lone soldier standing beside a marker stone deep in the woods. The uniform was wrong, older than anything in service, patched in places no regulation allowed. The man did not move when approached. "Are you lost?" the worker asked. The soldier turned his head slowly. "No," he said. "I am early." The worker laughed at the time. He told the story later as a curiosity, a joke to entertain colleagues. 3 weeks later, he was found dead in his cabin. No wounds, no signs of intrusion. He sat upright in a chair, hands on his knees, facing east. His watch had stopped at 02:17. The coroner ruled it heart failure. Privately, he requested reassignment. By then, certain patterns were no longer deniable. The phenomenon was not random. It was not bound to a single forest. It was not fading with time. It was organizing. Military historians would later note that the original unit, the one declared destroyed in 1944, had not been exceptional in strength, training, or mission. There was nothing remarkable about them on paper, except for one detail buried in after-action reports. They had been ordered to hold position, not retreat, not advance, hold, under sustained bombardment, without resupply, without reinforcement, until further notice. The notice never came. That detail mattered more than anyone understood at the time. In the private correspondence of a now-deceased general, discovered decades later, a single line appears underlined twice. "They did exactly what we asked." The implication was unsettling. If the soldiers had refused to die, perhaps it was because they had not been released. Not from life, from duty. This theory circulated quietly among a handful of analysts before being suppressed. It suggested something intolerable, that obedience, taken to its absolute extreme, might persist beyond the biological limits of the body. That something in war did not simply kill men. It reassigned them. In 1971, during the expansion of a highway near one of the original sighting zones, construction crews uncovered a shallow trench filled with military equipment. Helmets, rifles, packs, all neatly arranged, no bodies. The equipment was identified as belonging to multiple units, listed as missing or destroyed across several years. Items that should never have been in the same place. The arrangement was precise, not dumped, not buried in haste, laid out, as if prepared for inspection. Work was halted. Authorities arrived. The trench was sealed and filled within 48 hours. Official explanations cited improper wartime disposal. One worker was hospitalized after insisting that the equipment had not been there the previous day. He claimed he had walked the site the night before and seen nothing. "But I felt watched," he said, "like I was late." The phrase appeared again. Late, not lost, not dead. Late. In the late 1980s, after borders opened and archives loosened, civilians gained access to areas long restricted. Amateur historians and urban explorers ventured into forgotten zones, armed with cameras and curiosity. Some of them recorded things they did not understand. Footage surfaced, poor quality, grainy, often dismissed as hoaxes, showing figures moving through fogged forests at night. Not shambling, not aggressive, marching. Always marching. In one tape, captured by accident during a night hike, a man can be heard whispering as he films. "There's no sound," he says. "Listen. There should be sound." The figures pass between the trees without breaking stride. As they move out of frame, one turns its head. The camera shakes violently. The footage ends. The man who recorded it survived, but he never returned to the forest. In interviews, he refused to describe what he saw in the soldier's face. "It wasn't empty," he said. "That would have been easier." When pressed, he added only this: "He looked like someone waiting for permission." By the turn of the century, the phenomenon had receded again, not because it was weakening, but because it no longer needed witnesses. Something had changed. Environmental studies conducted near old battlefields began reporting unexplained electromagnetic fluctuations at night. Soil samples showed anomalous compaction, as if repeatedly compressed by weight, that left no permanent track. Animals continued to avoid certain corridors, forming unnatural migration gaps that puzzled biologists. And always, at 02:17, instruments glitched. Clocks skipped seconds. Sensors reset. Heart monitors in nearby hospitals recorded brief, synchronized irregularities across unrelated patients. No one connected the dots publicly. Privately, a new term appeared in restricted documents: residual command persistence. It described a theoretical state in which collective human intent, under extreme conditions, could outlast the individuals who generated it. The theory was never published. It ended with a recommendation: avoid issuing absolute orders without defined termination. Too late. The final confirmed sighting occurred in 2009. A border surveillance camera captured a single figure crossing a cleared strip of land just before dawn. The image was sharp enough to show uniform details. The cut was wrong. The insignia unidentifiable. The figure paused at the edge of the frame. For 6 seconds, it stood perfectly still. Then it raised its hand. Not in greeting, not in warning. In acknowledgement, as if responding to something that had finally arrived. The camera feed cut out immediately afterward. When technicians reviewed the footage, they noticed something no one had expected. The soldier cast no shadow. After that, nothing. No more sightings. No more reports. No more missing supplies. The forests grew loud again. Animals returned. The air felt lighter. Analysts declared the phenomenon concluded. They were careful, not to say resolved. Because resolution implied understanding, and understanding implied responsibility. Today, the files sit in archives few are authorized to open. Most who do read them come away unsettled by a single, recurring realization. The soldiers never attacked, never rebelled, never broke formation. They did not seek revenge. They did not haunt the living out of malice. They waited. They marched. They obeyed. And if they are gone now, if the forests have finally released them, it is not because time healed the wound. It is because somewhere, someone finally said the words that were missing in 1944. You are dismissed. Until then, remember this: war does not always end when the fighting stops. Sometimes, it ends only when the last order is undone. There is no ceremony for the end of an order. No trumpet. No marker on a map. No moment when everyone agrees that something has concluded. Orders do not die the way men do. They persist. They echo. They wait to be fulfilled. In the spring of 2011, a routine archival review uncovered a discrepancy buried so deeply that no one could remember why it existed in the first place. A set of wartime directives had been digitized decades earlier, but one sequence showed an irregularity, an incomplete command chain, flagged by the system but never resolved. It was nothing dramatic, just a missing closure. The directive in question dated back to late 1944, a regional defensive order issued under emergency conditions. Units assigned to hold position until further notice. The order was lawful, necessary, unremarkable. Except for one thing: the termination clause was never filed, not revoked, not superseded, not amended, simply absent. Historians would later argue that this was common during chaotic retreats, that paperwork was lost, offices destroyed, staff killed or displaced. They would insist the omission meant nothing. But systems do not forget what humans choose to ignore. The analyst who noticed the discrepancy was not looking for ghosts. He specialized in procedural failures, small errors that created large consequences. He requested the original file, expecting to find a clerical explanation. What he received instead was a thin folder marked with a designation that no longer existed. Inside were fragments, medical summaries, after-action reports, witness statements reclassified so many times they no longer belong to any category. And at the center of it all, a single unit designation. 37 men, declared destroyed, reappeared, reassigned without destination. The analyst read everything in one night. At 02:17, his system clock froze for 12 seconds. He noticed only afterward. The recommendation he drafted was simple. Not an investigation, not a public disclosure, a closure. He proposed issuing a formal termination notice for the original order. Purely administrative, symbolic even. A record correction, a historical footnote. His supervisor laughed at first. "You can't dismiss dead men," he said. The analyst did not argue. He submitted the request through the proper channels. It stalled. It was redirected. It was questioned, mocked, and nearly discarded. What saved it was language. He did not write that the men were still active. He wrote that the order was. That distinction mattered. The approval came quietly, buried among hundreds of routine corrections. No signatures of authority. No ceremony. Just a line added to an old directive. Order terminated. Personnel released from duty. The system time-stamped it, automatically. 02:17. No one noticed the time. That night, across several regions previously associated with unexplained anomalies, instruments recorded subtle changes. Magnetic fields stabilized. Ambient noise returned to baseline. Animal movement normalized. In one forest, long avoided by locals, birds nested for the first time in decades. No one celebrated. There were no reports of figures marching into light, no visions of soldiers saluting and fading away. Reality does not grant such comforts. What changed was absence. The pull some men had felt towards certain places simply vanished. Veterans who had woken for years at the same impossible minute slept through the night for the first time since their youth. A retired border guard wrote in his journal that the woods near his home felt finished. He could not explain what that meant. Neither could anyone else. The archives were sealed again, this time with intention rather than fear. The analyst transferred departments. He never spoke publicly about the case. Years later, when asked in private whether he believed the termination order had done anything at all, he paused for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he said, "but I know what happened when it was missing." That is the problem with absolute obedience. It does not ask why. It does not seek release. It waits. The soldiers who refused to die did not defy death. They complied with something stronger. They followed an instruction that outlived the bodies it was given to. They stood where they were told to stand. They held where they were told to hold. They waited for a notice that never arrived, until it did. There are no memorials for them, no names carved into stone, no ceremonies marking their service. Officially, they remain what they were declared to be in 1944, lost. But loss implies confusion, and there was nothing confused about what they did. They were precise. They were disciplined. They were correct. If there is a lesson buried in their story, it is not a supernatural one. It is administrative. War teaches men how to die. Bureaucracy teaches them how to wait forever. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can give a human being is not hatred, not fear, not even violence, but an order without an ending.